3, 2, 1.
Hi, and a very warm welcome to this, which is the first critical conversation we'll be holding this on the topic of museum collecting today. So this is designed as a series of events that we're hoping will kickstart a meaningful dialogue around the university museums, their history, and how you can engage with their current activities and future plans. So one item of housekeeping, if you wish to turn on the live captions, you can do so at the bottom right of your screen, go into settings, and there you can turn on live captions. So I'll start by introducing myself, and then I'll introduce our three panelists today. I'm Emma Bond. I'm an academic in the School of Modern Languages, and I'll be moderating the Critical Conversations series. My work is concerned with the transnational circulation of people, texts and objects, and I work a lot on migration, diaspora and cultural representations. For the past 5 years, I've been working on a series of projects with a museum in Greenock on the west coast of Scotland, exploring ways to tell the complex history of sugar refining in the town. In 2018, I set up a network of museums called Transnational Scotland, which aim to highlight stories relating to empire and colonialism in heritage collections across the country. I've worked with the V&A Dundee on a journey to decolonise their permanent design galleries, and I'm organising an exhibition in collaboration with the museums unit here, which will take place in the Wardlaw Museum in St Andrews in 2022, called Recollecting Empire. Recollecting Empire is the start of a journey, and we wanted to start it right now, much in advance, together with the student community, and we want to engage with processes that encourage diversity and decolonisation. And that's why we're linking these events into the exhibition. We want to include a lot of voices in the planning and in the programming that surround it. And one of the first steps will be to produce a kind of mission statement that sets out our commitment to decolonisation. And it's a work in progress, and we'll use these discussions to feed into that statement of purpose and then share it with you when it's ready in draft form, and we'll use that for future discussion. So this evening, we're very, very lucky to have with us Dr. Katie Eagleton, the Director of Libraries and Museums at the University. We're also joined by Anania Jain, who is the BAME Association Officer, and she's been working really closely with us on designing these events, so it's great to have her with us as well. And we've also got Natalie Hopwood, who's here representing the History Society, so a really great panel to talk about the museum and its collections. I'll just briefly talk you through the structure of the event. We're going to start with 5-minute presentations from each of our panelists, in which they'll share their own interests in the questions that underpin these events. So we're really thinking about which voices are hidden and which voices are present in museum collections, which stories are told and which stories are not told, and which histories remain hidden, and how can we move forward as museums and as people who visit and care about museums. We'll then move on to look at one particular object in the collection, and there will be a link in the announcements tab, so you can see an image of that object. It's one of the earliest objects to enter the museum collection, and Katie's going to tell us very kindly a little bit more about that object when we come to it. After we've seen that, we'll have a very general discussion building on the presentations and the introduction of the object and the overarching theme of the event. So please do send in your questions. You can post comments and questions to the live Q&A, and we'll answer them all, or aim to. If there are too many to answer, then we'll hold them and answer to them after the event as well. So we're aiming to have no question unanswered eventually. And we really wanted to ground each of these three conversations in a particular object. I think that objects offer us pathways into histories, and even simple objects can tell multiple and complex stories. These stories join up the people who made and used each object with the people who acquired or collected it, and with the people who encounter the object in heritage settings today, so that includes all of us. They make us reflect on why certain things are treasured and kept in collections, why they acquire value or meaning, and why others might be lost, broken or disposed of. They also help us to look towards the future through juxtaposition and meanings. Through 3 conversations, we will have, in a sense, assembled a new mini collection of our own, and that's exciting in terms of the new meanings and stories that we will have created. So I'll pass over to Katie first, and then we'll hear from Anania and then from Natalie.
Thank you, Emma, and I'm really delighted that we're starting this series and having this conversation with everybody in our community in St Andrews, because the thing that surprises some people is just how global and transnational our collections here are. It's really easy to imagine that this is a little place on the coast of Fife and that then we might have lots of nice medieval Scottish things, but actually we have a really interesting and unusual collection given the history of the place. What I thought I'd do in a way is introduce the object and the museums at the same time, because through the object I can give you a kind of run through of some of the complex history here and also some of the questions that we'll be talking about together. So the object that we're talking about today is a bark basket from 1728. Well, it was given to the university in 1728. We actually know very little about it before that point. We know that it's very likely Cree, probably from the Hudson's Bay or James Bay area in what's today Canada. But that's a huge geographical area and a diverse group of peoples, and it's more a kind of language group of peoples rather than a very specific designation. We don't know who acquired this basket, when they gave it to the university other than in 1728. We don't know why they gave it. We don't know who it is that brought it from Canada to Scotland, and if that's the same person who then gave it to the university. There's obvious connections though, because in the 18th century, the Hudson's Bay Company was very active in the fur trade in the area that this basket comes from. And that was a trade involving exchanging trade goods, which included things like blankets and alcohol and firearms, with First Nations and Indigenous peoples. And they were exchanging them for beaver pelts. And you might be wondering, what does Europe and Scotland at this period have a use of beaver pelts for? Well, they were for felt, which meant they were for hats. So your 19th century image of a gentleman in a top hat, that's the fur trade, that's the Hudson's Bay fur trade, providing all those beaver pelts. And because of that trade, there are quite a lot of similar baskets to ours in collections around the world. They were used for collecting and storing food. They're quite beautifully made from birch bark. They're decorated with porcupine quills, but they're in some ways quite domestic objects. Ours is one of the earliest ones that we know of in UK collections, but not the very earliest. There's a nested set in the British Museum that was given by Hans Sloane earlier than we were given ours. But like I said, we don't know when it came from Canada to Scotland. We just know that it was in St Andrews by 1728. And we also know it's one of the very first artifacts that was given to the university with a sort of intention that be part of a collection or a display. And you might be wondering, okay, so what is the context then for displaying this thing in the 18th century in St Andrews? Because the university then wasn't the sort of thriving and busy place it is today. It was in a bit of a state of decline. It was struggling financially. It was struggling to attract students. There was St Mary's College on South Street and there was United College on North Street, but the place wasn't like it is today. The kind of whole town is part of, and the kind of campus across the whole town. But what happened in the 1760s was a new university library was built. And this basket was displayed in the library along with the books and along with a collection of other things that were called at the time curiosities. And the timing is really interesting here, because if you think about it, the British Museum had just been founded in 1753. The Ashmolean in Oxford had been around a little bit longer, but there's this very sort of strong tradition in the 18th century of the gentlemanly cabinet of curiosities, where you have objects from the natural world, objects collected from human cultures around the world, and these were often displayed together. And the reason we know a bit about it in the 18th century in St Andrews is that visitors who came to St Andrews as tourists at that time wrote about their visit. They would write that they went to the cathedral, often the castle, and they came to see the university library. And what's interesting is they saw the new university library in the 1770s, 80s and 90s as modern and elegant. And part of that modernity in the 18th century in Enlightenment Scotland was the curiosities as well as the books. So the knowledge about the world at that point was in both. So then we're now going to fast forward through from then to now, because I think that's an equally interesting story about the way this object changes its context and the way its meaning gets framed differently at different times. So in 1838, the Literary and Philosophical Society was founded in St Andrews, and that's a society that really aimed and did found a university museum. It was a joint effort between the town and the university. And the university transferred the curiosities from the library, including this basket, to the new museum. And very quickly, they'd set up the museum in Upper College Hall. And for those of you who are more new to the university, that's a space that's off St Salvator's Quad, right in the centre of the university in the United College buildings. It's still a very grand space today. There's some amazing photos of it full of taxidermy in the 19th century, but I so far haven't persuaded the principal to let me put all the taxidermy back in there. I'll keep trying. But the collection at that point, the taxidermy is important because it became in the 19th century much more of a natural, historical and zoological collection, also with archaeology and what was then termed ethnographic objects. So the objects had stopped being curiosities and now became ethnography. And they were displayed alongside the natural world. So our basket is there on display in Upper College Hall. And in 1904, there's a complete listing of the entire display. So we can see not just that it was there, but how it was kind of displayed, the stories and the arguments that the display was creating. And it was displayed there with other objects from around the world. So some of those were the curiosities from the university library. Others were objects collected through 19th century imperial and colonial networks. So it gains a different kind of relationship to those other objects in the 19th century, and it's displayed differently by 1904. So then fast forward to today, the museum's moved a couple of times since then. The basket's still in our collection and it's still something we really treasure, but we think very differently about it now. We know almost nothing about the circumstances in which it was acquired, as I said. We don't know in Canada whether the exchange through which it was acquired was equitable. We don't know much at all about how that transaction or that exchange or that gift, if that's what it was, worked. We don't know what the people involved thought of the transaction on both sides. We don't know about the power relationships and the expectations. And then in St Andrews, we know almost as little. We don't know who gave it to the university, therefore it's hard to track the transnational networks that brought it here. And that causes really interesting challenges for us because we're working in the museums team on researching provenance for objects in our collection and to try and give voice to the people that made and used and from whom objects were acquired. But how to do that for an object like this one, where we have only the most general sense of the date and place, and we can only think about it in relation to other objects of its type. Soon, we hope very soon, but we'll keep you updated on that, the basket will be on display in the new Wardlaw Museum, which has been redeveloped and redisplayed completely in the last 2 years. It will be in a thematic gallery that we're calling Expanding Horizons. And that's a gallery that really looks at this whole question of the connections between St Andrews and the world through the 18th, 19th, 20th and now 21st centuries. It's displayed there differently though to how it has been in other displays in the university in the past. It's displayed in a way that encourages visitors, we hope, to think about the origins of the collection and to think about the imperial and colonial networks that St Andrews was part of in the 19th century and through which objects like this one were acquired. And then bringing it right up to date. I just heard literally this morning that the museums team have almost finished 3D scanning the birch bark basket. So we'll be putting it on display in the Wardlaw Museum and then making that model available online so that people can connect it with other objects, compare it to similar ones in other collections, and really make it something that isn't just a treasure for us, but it's something we're sharing much more actively. Thank you. Emma, you're muted.
Muted. Thank you very much, Katie, for pointing that out as well. Thanks for that brilliant run through of the history. I'm going to pass straight on to Anania now to give us her perspective.
So hi everyone, I'm Anania and I'm currently the BAME Association Officer with the Students Association. I was formerly known as the Member for Racial Equality and the change is very, very recent. Personally, I think it's very interesting that Katie brought up this new way in which this object is going to be displayed in a more thematic manner, actually looking at its imperial origins. Because traditionally, so I'm originally from India, and I think the influence of museums in my life is also quite personal because I do study art history and history as well. And coming from a country that has previously been has colonial links and very major colonial links, I think I'm quite interested in looking at museums from the perspective of a country that's been colonized. So museums as a concept came into India only after the colonial period, and it was brought in with the colonizers. And what I usually find very fascinating is going into a museum outside India and looking at artifacts from my very own country, which are obviously far more valuable than the ones we have here. And that always fascinates me. That said, obviously, they, like museum labels, are also something that are quite interesting, because typically and traditionally, I have seen that they're very vague geographically, and they do try to describe the objects in some ways, but what often tends to happen is that description or that label is quite generic. And that's what I'm interested in looking at. And that's why I feel like, because this particular object is so interesting, and in the way it's going to be displayed now, that thematic and the imperial connections will actually be looked at. I think that's a new way of looking at it, at least if you look at a traditional museum or gallery environment. And I think that's what we need more of in general. To give a bit of more context on things I'm interested in and what we are planning to do as the BAME network, I think, so as part of being a BAME association officer, I do lead, and I'm the president of the BAME Students Network, which is again fairly new. And we're only just getting established. We existed informally last year. And we're looking towards making, while we understand the term BAME is obviously has its limitations, and it does tend to essentialize this minority experience into one almost, which it isn't. We want to ensure that these different identities are also treated as separate. So I think in light of that, we want to focus on various different aspects of the BAME experience. That's not just representation or just focused on academia, but how we can move beyond just ticking the boxes and looking diverse. And I think this particular project and even this discussion itself is a great starting point to that, because like collecting itself, like Katie was saying, collecting and this idea of curiosity itself, I understand, comes from a position of privilege. So when we talk about the purpose of this session and who controls the narrative and who tells the story, it's often the person who's brought that object back into this Western environment, right? We often don't get to hear the story of where the object comes from the actual maker of the object, because the sources we have or the people who've written about it are often from a certain context. And I think that's very interesting to consider. And I'm really glad that it's coming into this mainstream conversation, which museums are taking, because museums have been dominant institutions. It's where the public goes to get information, and it's always been that way, right? And I think beyond just a simplistic depiction of objects or a collection of objects, like an interesting thing I would say is that in India, the traditional term for museums is an ajab ghar. So like it's a house of curiosities. That's just what museums are called traditionally, right? And beyond just displaying objects to telling their stories, beyond just where they come from, but how they come there. And I think that's why I'm very drawn to these conversations. And I think looking at collecting in its real context, in the context, and not shying away from that, not talking about how or trying to hide that reality. I think if we take that reality into consideration and if we are able to accept that, it will only add to the process. It's only going to help us actually discover what museums are for and what potential they have to actually change perspectives. So that's essentially what I've been doing and why I'm very involved, very invested with this series, because I think it has that capacity to bring about that change beyond just one talk or one training or one briefing, because it's an ongoing conversation. And I think that's what it's about.
Thank you very much, Anania, for that really rich reflection. We'll move straight on to Natalie now.
Hi, I'm Natalie. I am currently the acting secretary of the History Society, and I'm also the treasurer of the Student Archaeology Society. Both societies, we're obviously all interested in museums because it's a way to visually see history. But as an American, obviously, we can connect to the basket because we constantly learn about all the injustices done to Native Americans, all the things that were taken and traded, whether, legitimately or illegitimately. But I kind of wanted to bring to the table a outside perspective because I am a medieval historian and I particularly focus on early medieval in the British Isles, which very clearly has a different aspect of respect when it comes to museum curations. And I wanted to bring particularly a comparison in the British Museum of all of the objects that are from Egypt versus, say, the Sutton Hoo exhibit, which is from East Anglia. And for Sutton Hoo, obviously, the British Museum's in London. Sutton Hoo is in Suffolk. Very close together, very easily seen by the descendants of the people that would have been buried in a style similar to the Sutton Hoo ship burial. However, then you take the Rosetta Stone, the Shabtis of Seti I, and so on that are in the British Museum from ancient Egypt. And suddenly you see, well, you're going to have to travel however many hundreds of miles to be able to see something equally as important to your culture, even older than the Sutton Hoo ship burial. And it suddenly makes you question, well, why are these in the same place? Why are they treated as if, like, one is very important to the culture, but the other one was brought over in the early 1900s because it was interesting? Like, back in early archaeology of ancient Egypt, people would throw away the mummies because they weren't important. They would just keep all of the riches because they were shiny and they looked interesting. Meanwhile, in anything that was being explored in Britain, you wanted to keep everything, whether it was an arrowhead from the Bronze Age or the remnants of what might be a henge from the Celtic or Pictish peoples that lived there. And it's kind of interesting because I don't want to just be like, oh, I'll take for granted that I have a area of study that's more respected and more researched, because if I'm studying Vikings that were living around Jorvik, I'm going to go down to York and then it's going to be no problem. Meanwhile, if I wanted to branch out and look at, say, Arabic connections to the Vikings and their trading units, it's immediately a completely different question. And I think restructuring how the museum should function in how it displays its objects and how it treats different objects from different areas and different time periods is so important, because otherwise everything becomes very stale and bland, and then you can't have a discussion about it if you aren't perceiving it in a way that is equal and respectful, no matter where it comes from. That's me.
Thank you all for those really, really exciting presentations. We could almost call them provocations. I really like how, Natalie, you introduced a kind of a temporal perspective and thinking about different positionalities in time. And Anania, you introduced this idea of spatial perspectives, in a sense. What's curious where, right? Something that's curious to us might not be, or might be differently somewhere else. And Katie just gave us so much to think about in terms of the history of the collection. Katie, I wondered if I could just ask you a question, because quite a lot of what you were describing was, it struck me, quite a gendered story as well. So, you know, beaver fur hats for men, Hans Sloane, obviously this very gentlemanly kind of conception of both collecting and museums as something for the male. I was wondering if you could insert back into those some of the perhaps the stories of women who might have been involved in the university collections?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, precisely because on one level, it is a very male-gendered story. If you look at the members of the Literary and Philosophical Society in the foundation, say in 1838, they're all men. If you look at the people in the university who were putting the university library together and teaching and studying, they're all men in the 18th century. But if you look at the records through the 19th century of the material that was acquired through these imperial and colonial networks, there are a lot of women in there. And so they're giving objects to the museum, they're sometimes buying things, sometimes donating things. And there's a much more interesting and complicated picture that emerges when you stop looking at the kind of people whose names are on the letterhead almost, the people who are the members and the founders and the sort of celebrated people. And you start looking at the collection a bit deeper down. And I know the same's true as well of the British Museum, because a friend of mine, Sushma Jansari, is a curator there. And she's worked on female South Asian collectors, and both South Asian people and people resident in South Asia, so the two. And it's really fascinating because you think it's not there, but as soon as you start looking for it, it is. And so there's a real work for us to do to rebalance the story we're telling. But it is a real challenge because all the kind of founder stories are all male. And interestingly, with our basket, what I don't know, because I'm not a specialist on this particular kind of material culture, I try really carefully not to gender it either way, even though it's a domestic object, because I would have to ask somebody who really knew this topic about whether the gathering and storing of food was particularly gendered for Cree peoples. So I'd be really interested if there's anybody here today who knows that, because that's a gap in my knowledge at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. And that's a reminder as well, if anyone listening does have questions, then you can publish them in the live Q&A. And if you want to also specify who your question is for, then I'll direct it straight to that speaker. So we were thinking as well around visualizations of history. This was a term that you mentioned, Natalie, which I think is a really strong phrase to use, how we visualize histories. And I think it's exciting because we're kind of all circling around the British Museum. Maybe that's inevitable. But given the news today that broke around what some people, at least some media outlets, were terming the removal of a bust of Hans Sloane, when it was actually just placed into a different display case, contextualized with objects that he collected, and a little bit of a narrative around that, I believe. But the kind of hysteria that built up around this idea that had been unvisualized, if you like, sort of taken out of the visualization of the history of that museum is really interesting. Katie, is that something that you reflect on in the new displays, is precisely the build-up of the collection and how that was put together in different phases, as you did for us tonight?
In the displays in the Wardlaw Museum, we don't have a kind of space to go into huge detail, but we're doing other projects that wrap around it. I quite often think of museum displays as the kind of tip of the iceberg, and the research that we do drives a lot of other kinds of outputs, a lot of other ways of thinking about the collection. So we're pushing really hard to put more and more of it online, not just for kind of access in a more passive sense, but because that provides a way of people making their own connections and providing their own contexts, so that it's not only us kind of broadcasting our narrative about the objects. We provide a way to think about them, but we don't want it to be the only way people talk and think about them. To the British Museum, though, I mean, let's go there, because I worked at the British Museum in 2007 when there was the 200th anniversary of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in British colonies and territories. And it was really interesting at the time that we did some temporary displays, we did some trails, we did some recontextualization, and we all thought we were changing the British Museum for the better. And now, listening to the news today, you'd believe that had never been done. So I think the real challenge for museums isn't just to have the overlay and the temporary, it's to take that and change what's underneath, to change the way we think about our collections, talk about our collections, and to sort of get out of this cycle of every few years, not the same thing, but similar kinds of efforts are made, and they don't really fundamentally change our museums, because I've been around enough cycles now to feel like it's time for a more permanent change.
I think, I mean, that's a really, really interesting point, that it's not so much necessarily what's on display, it's the processes that go into making those displays, but it's also about, as you said, research. It's also about communication, right? And it would be great to hear from both Anania and from Natalie about the kinds of communication that we could try and put in place with our student community and our changing up those stories, as Katie was saying, and perhaps allowing the work that is going on to be communicated better. So I don't know whether either of you want to jump in at that point and share any ideas around how we can involve people in doing that kind of research and that sort of engagement activity. Maybe Anania first.
So I personally think that the first step is collaboration. So I feel like if there aren't these different voices who are there amongst people who are making the decisions, that's when you have a problem. And I think the university museums have already begun to do that and have people with different voices and different interests on an advisory board or on like the people who make decisions. And I think that's what encourages different perspectives in such a field specifically, which is often traditionally dominated by a certain kind of people or a certain race of people. And I think having different perspectives in that is something that I think is very necessary, because as like from the beginning, we are conditioned to believe that things are meant to function a certain way. So this is almost a sort of deconditioning or unconditioning of that traditional narrative. And I think that is very difficult to do. It's not necessarily easy if you've been conditioned to think in a certain way or view the museum as a certain kind of institution. I don't think it's very easy to do. And to do that, I think we need a different set of voices, and we need more voices. So like diverse set of voices, and like in general, the conversation should be started.
Thank you. And Natalie, would you like to share any ideas you have?
Yeah, I fully agree with what's already been said. And if you specifically want to talk about, involving students, it's very important, like, especially as social media is so prevalent to, like, I feel like a lot of students hear, oh, there are museums in St. Andrews, but they don't really know what that means, what they have, and more importantly, how to get their voices heard. When it comes to changing up the system, basically. And so allowing a greater amount of student voices to kind of be able to make comments, such as with the basket, being able to just post the picture like we did on the event for this and have them be able to look at it, then, oh, start thinking about it, then realize, oh, what does this mean? Maybe I should look more into it. I should ask more questions. And kind of making like a jump off point for both discussion and further research, because if someone doesn't know all of the things that are in the museum and they see something that they like, it's very important to then have the opportunity to be like, oh, where is this from? What do we know about it? And more importantly, what context are we viewing this in? Because especially as a history student, the context when you go into a museum is, oh, this is just in the museum. It doesn't really matter where it came from. It's just, this is the general area. Here's a few details about it, and then like look at it and maybe take a picture of it if you're allowed to. But greater discussion, greater, like as Anania said, greater collaboration, and just hearing both student voices and professional voices is incredibly important.
I can maybe, if I can jump in, there's a really great example I can share with everybody of where getting more voices involved transforms what you can say about an object. And it's another object that's going to be in the Wardlaw Museum, and it's from Papua New Guinea. And it's a mouth ornament, a very high status mouth ornament. And it was in our collection, and we're working with a group of students on provenance for the collection. And we thought this object in our collection might be one that was referred to as acquired in 1837-8 by the university. But we weren't totally sure because the description kind of didn't match. and the place names didn't match, and we thought, oh, is this the right thing? And then through a series of sort of chance conversations with the group of students, and then with one of the staff in social anthropology, who pointed out to us that somebody who's a PhD student in social anthropology is from Papua New Guinea and works at the National Museum. And through him, we got in touch with local specialists in the islands where this thing came from, who've now helped us pinpoint really rather precisely, not just where it came from, but how to reconcile the conflicting information, which actually, when you have that local knowledge, makes total sense, and it doesn't conflict at all, because it's to do with very local trade routes. And so it all started with a conversation with the students, just asking, what's this thing, why is it here, and is it the same thing as this other thing? And we now, in the museum, will have a label in the words of those local specialists, because they know more about this object than we do. And that, for me, is when it goes the best, when you can suddenly really tell the full story of an object by respecting different input and talking to people and working with people.
Great, thank you for that. We've actually got a question in, which I'll read out in case people can't see it. So what are your views on objects in museums that were taken by Britain when it was a colonial power from other countries that constituted its empire? How should they be displayed? I mean, it's a big question that goes really straight to the heart of what we're trying to discuss. I don't know whether Anania or Natalie or Katie, anyone wants to jump in and tackle quite a big question.
Well, how about I start, and then Anania and Natalie can maybe respond and reflect. I'm going to give a very short answer, which is they have to be displayed openly, transparently, and with specificity about the contexts and circumstances that they come from and the circumstances of their acquisition as far as we know it. And the openness and transparency is important. So that's it for me, openly, transparently, and with specificity.
And then,
yeah, I completely agree with what Katie just said. And personally, having seen, and I know I'm bringing the conversation back to a very personal context, but I think that's where my curiosity comes from. And personally, having seen very important objects that have been part of a history which I've studied, displayed in other countries with labels such as, this was gifted to a prince over here when it was clearly conquered and it was clearly taken away. For me, it on the label or having to this other country from is very important, and I don't think that can serve to harm the museum, our historical understanding of these objects. So to acknowledge the fact that these were maybe wrongfully taken or maybe taken in a context which we're unaware of, I think that's very important, because I don't think history and museums are necessarily about definitive answers. They're about conversations, they're about ways of thinking, and it's okay if we don't know whether it was a correct means of getting it or whether it was just some sort of conquering or taking a loot or plunder. And it's fine to say that we don't know sometimes. So I think because some of the contexts of these objects are quite ambiguous, but we don't necessarily have to have all the answers. So I think that's also okay, and that's something we should consider.
Absolutely. Natalie, do you have any other comments on that?
Yeah, I agree with everything, but the important thing is that there are several examples, especially in the British Museum running theme, of basically the original, well, you can't say the original owners, but the original country of origin has asked for their objects back. The most famous is the Rosetta Stone, where the Egyptian government asked, can we please have this super important engraving that, you know, cracked how to read hieroglyphs, and the British government just said no. And what are we supposed to do about that? Because it's not, it goes back to the idea of like, oh, it was given as a gift, right? Or anything like that. It's clearly, it wasn't necessarily taken correctly. And what is the question of what should you do if the country of origin asks for it back, especially when it is something so prevalent. A similar thing happened in Germany with like the super famous bust of Nefertiti. Again, the Egyptian government asked for it and the German government said no. So that's the kind of moral question where it's like, can you even display something like that if you are going against the express wishes of the people who should technically have it, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know whether Katie, you have any final comments on that as a former British Museum expert.
Yeah. Well, I think what's really important there is the way I think Manchester Museum handle this really well is they talk about relationships. So they say, okay, it's about objects, but it's about relationships. And so having worked at the British Museum and British Library, yes, there are legal restrictions on returning objects, but we always felt when managing those collections, like if you fell back on the legal prevention, you were kind of on a losing argument, because what we preferred much more to do is positively and proactively work collaboratively and in a respectful way to make sure that as far as possible those institutions are good stewards of those objects. Now that isn't always going to be something that claimant countries can agree, right? There's a fundamental problem, right? They want the object. But for me, the solution isn't to hide it. The solution is to even more actively be helping people access it and understand it and learn about it and to work really actively with those countries. But the interesting kind of flip side that doesn't make the media as much is there are also cases where, and I'm thinking of one in particular that for obvious reasons I can't give you any detail on, which is in a past job. There was an object that had come from an institution in India. We were almost certain it had been stolen in the 1970s, that it had entered the UK illegally, and that we were basically very, very clear it should not have been acquired. And because of the precise legal status it was under, we were in a position to deaccession and offer it back. And the institution refused to even talk to us, because to talk to us and accept the return would have been to admit that the theft had happened. And it was still too recent for individuals and too difficult and tricky in the specifics of the local context to even have that conversation. And so we actually ended up writing to the institution saying, please put this letter on file. Whenever you're ready, we regard this as yours. We will take care of it for you until you would like to ask for it. And we hoped that at some point, we didn't know if it was going to be 10 years or 100 years time, somebody will find that letter and take the institution that I can't name up on the promise. Because it's really, really complicated when you get into more recent cases. In a funny sort of way, the imperial cases are easier because they're further back in the past, because there's fewer contemporary complexities with them. So it's always got to be case by case. It's always got to be about relationships and not just about kind of legal ownership of objects. But it is a really fascinating challenge for museums to show themselves to be good stewards of these collections, because the minute they're not, then the case is much harder to justify.
Yeah. So I think we've definitely put together what we think a museum should be, which is a place for taking care. It's a place for conversations, and it's a place for relationships. And I'm going to wrap up now, but I wanted just to say for everyone listening, please do keep your eye out for some creative prompts which are going to appear on the Countdown channel. I can't say too much about them because they're top secret surprise, but they are going to provide a way for you to respond to this evening's discussion in an open-ended and creative way that will also then tie into future discussions and future events and activities. So we're really looking forward to engaging with you through the creative prompts and seeing you at the next two conversations. The next one is the same time, so it's Tuesday, 1st of September, 6:15. We'll be joined by Dr. Anania Chowdhury from the School of English and other panelists, where we'll be discussing more about empire. So join us then, and thank you again to the panelists who've done a fantastic job. Thank you.